5 books and counting. The Tales from the Omni Vault continues to expand as a universe. Go ahead and check the links down in the description to get your copies today. Hello ladies and gentlemen, I'm the Omni Viewer, and I'm here with another Author's Take On video. One that might at first seem spicy considering that I'm a man talking about how to write women, but then again, I feel like as long as you're writing a good story, it doesn't matter what sort of character you're writing. And I figure it's a good time to talk about this in particular because I do have a new book that, as of this video's posting, is just about ready. Like, it'll be going up any day now. And of course, if you're watching this in the future, I hope you enjoy that book. But even then, I've already written multiple female characters in the books I have published, including one who is indeed the protagonist. So, you know, I feel like I should probably say a little bit of something about this. However, this was also partly inspired by a video I saw from a channel called Book Fox, which is about different bits of writing advice and everything. And the video in question was, I think, 8 lies that writing gurus are telling you. Now, having watched the video, I do think it's a good video. It takes all sorts of different lines, like famous lines from famous authors and writing critics and whatnot, that generally get passed around writing circles as good advice, and basically breaking down why you shouldn't necessarily take them as absolutes. And that's the thing, it really isn't about exposing them as lies. It's more about saying they're not things you should hold hard and fast to because there's a bit more nuance to be played with. You can actually reject the advice entirely if you want. And then again, I suppose calling the video 8 different lines about writing from famous authors that you can take as good advice or reject because ultimately they're oversimplifying something that takes a lot of nuance, but we're going to break it down anyway, is a bit of a long and cumbersome title. Anyway, the inspiration is that there was one bit of writing advice I'm familiar with that didn't make that particular video, but it popped into my head after watching it, and I thought it might make for an interesting discussion topic. Another little bit of advice you may have heard is the old saying, write female characters the same way you write male characters. Now, the weird thing is that the source I can cite this line to isn't from a well-established author who wrote all kinds of classic novels that are held in the highest regard and taught in schools and everything. Rather, it comes from Sylvia Anderson, who is one of the co-creators of Thunderbirds. You know, Thunderbirds, the show that's either a favorite of children because of the cool ships, or it gives children nightmares because of the marionettes. Thunderbirds is a good show, don't get me wrong, but you do kind of have to overcome the uncanny valley effect. That's beside the point, though. You see, if you watch the behind the scenes of the series or one of the movies, or I think the documentary filmed in Super Marionation might mention it, there's a character on the show called Lady Penelope, who's the only female protagonist, the only regular female character. Well, no, not the only one, but like she's the only one who gets in on the action along with all the male characters who actually pilot the different Thunderbird vehicles. And in the first couple of episodes, she isn't very well written because Thunderbirds was a show that was made for a young male audience. And at that point, the writers weren't entirely sure how to make an interesting female character in a series where the target audience thought that all girls have cooties. So they kind of struggled for a little bit, and eventually Sylvia Anderson just went to the writing staff and said, look, forget about the fact that Lady Penelope is the girl. Write her the same way you're writing the male characters, and you'll be able to get past this. So they started doing that, and her character greatly improved. This may not be the exact origin of where the idea that you should write female characters the same way you write male characters came from, but it's a popular one, at least. A popular place where the idea spread, if not originated. And I also find it's a piece of advice that's very easy to misinterpret, even though it is something I think you ultimately should consider. And the reason it's easy to misinterpret, well, the different nuances are what we'll be getting into from here on out. So what does that line of advice actually mean? Write female characters the way you write male characters. Well, there's no shortage of stories with male characters in them, certainly. So how are those characters written? How do you write a male character? Well, you give them motivations, different interpersonal relationships, backstories, goals, an arc that they go through so that they can experience growth and maybe change by the end. And of course, I'm sure some of you have already picked up on this and thought, wait a minute, that's just character writing. Well, yes, it is. What it means is that it doesn't matter if the character is male or female. Write them with complexity. Give them good stories. Make them interesting. Make them the sort of characters people love, or love to hate if they're villains, perhaps. But why is it the sort of thing that seems to be divided by sex? Why is it that you have to specify write females the same way you write males? Well, maybe you don't have to specify it so much these days, but there was a time where it did have to be specified. Now, I want to be very clear. The idea that female characters have always been terribly written, that is not an absolute truth. There have always been interesting female characters throughout all of fiction, in varying degrees. But the fact remains that when it comes to male-focused genres, particularly stuff like sci-fi and horror and action and whatnot, that they tend to be very male-dominated, both in the audience and in the casting, the characters that you see there. And again, I know that's a general statement. I know that girls can like all of this stuff as well, but generally speaking, it's guys who like them. And also, generally speaking, in the past, girls were not as open about liking stuff like that because it was considered unusual. Now, despite being male-dominated, you could find plenty of novels, dime store pulps, comic books, and what have you, where there were interesting female characters alongside the male protagonists, even if those female characters often got relegated to the role of the girlfriend or the damsel in distress or something. Two roles that often go hand in hand, I realize. You could still find them in interesting ways, finding them to be sort of proactive in their own ways, good fits for the male leads, things like that. Deja Thorison, John Carter of Mars, when she's introduced to us, she seems like the ultimate damsel in distress because we first meet her as a prisoner, and she stays a prisoner for a good chunk of that first Barsoom book. But in the first scene where we really get to meet her, because in the first scene we meet her, she doesn't really speak and she's taken away before John Carter can actually properly get to know her. But the scene where she's brought before the leader of her Green Martian captors, she stands boldly before him and delivers this impassioned speech about how war between the Red Martians and the Green Martians is futile and it would be better if they joined forces for the greater good of Barsoom. And she proclaims this. She very nearly ends that conflict of the book right then and there. If only she hadn't been speaking to a complete uncaring despot, she might have actually succeeded. Now that does not strike me as a weak-willed, helpless woman. That is a very strong and confident woman who then goes on to become the perfect love interest for John Carter. And yeah, she does kind of keep falling into the role of damsel in distress over the first 3 books especially, but still, like, she is bold, she is very well spoken, she knows how to win people over to her side. My friends, that is a strong, well-written woman. Anyone else think it's getting a little bit warm in here? Anyway, that's just one example. I don't want to get bogged down in too many. But that's from, like, disposable pulp from back in the day. The sort of thing that wouldn't have been looked upon as high literature. And we still got a good character like that. Problem is, the more a trope gets reused, the more it gets watered down. And as things continued, the low standard for female characters gradually became where the bar was permanently set. And less effort was put into making the female characters interesting. This was a male-dominated industry. That's just the way it was. Most women weren't looking to get into writing pulp fiction or comics or something. And the audience was also predominantly male, and either they didn't see any issue with having the female characters be written as weaker and uninteresting, or maybe they did see an issue, but they didn't necessarily have any solutions. Or if they did offer solutions, they weren't listened to. So things just sort of became watered down, like I said. But that meant that other examples where good female characters came along really stood out. Stuff like the original Star Trek, the original Star Wars, the horror movies that became so dominant in the late 70s and all throughout the 80s. It was a gradual process. Things were changing slowly, but things were still changing. And of course, comics still had characters like Wonder Woman, who had been pretty consistently popular since her introduction in 1941 and never fully went away, even if she went through some weird periods, like that time she lost her powers and just became a normal person who knew karate. But, you know, we all like to ignore that part. I don't think it's even canon anymore. That being said, though, the changes were coming along. People were starting to realize that they had to put more emphasis on making the female characters interesting, especially as more stories were coming along that were putting them front and center. Stories like Terminator or Alien or things like that. And something that really sped up the process was when the American anime and manga importation industry took off. Anime and manga, of course, became really popular because it was so different from what the West was producing, and it turns out a lot of anime has female protagonists. Not just the stuff that was aimed at girls, but also some stuff that was aimed at boys. Now, the reason why there were so many male-centered anime with female protagonists could be called a bit shallow, because it turns out Japan, over there, their culture really values cuteness, the same way American culture values sexiness. And it turns out a young boy might like watching giant robots, but he really likes watching giant robots piloted by cute girls. So that's sort of how that came to be. But at the same time, it does result in some very interesting characters. So that sped things up, especially since as anime and manga started to outperform the American stuff had to adapt in order to keep up. But then again, sometimes all you had to do was just get the right person on board to come up with the stories. I've mentioned this in the past, but I really do recommend watching the documentary Chris Claremont's X-Men, because it really is a great insight into a brilliant writer. And one of the things it mentions towards the end is the fact that Chris Claremont actually diversified the X-Men more than any author before him. And the way he did that was, as he was coming up with a new character, he would come up with different traits, powers, where he wanted the story to go. And at a certain point in the process, which probably varied depending on how far along he was going, he would ask himself if there was any reason this character could not be, let's say to stay on topic, a woman. And if he couldn't think of a reason why the character couldn't be a woman, the character was a woman from that point onward. Now, something they don't mention in the documentary is that you can kind of infer that if he asked the question and sometimes arrived at the answer yes, that means sometimes he arrived at the answer no. There was something about it that required the character to be male that he just couldn't get around, so the character remained male. But he still would ask that question pretty much every time he was coming up with a new character, or maybe it wasn't just should the character be a woman, maybe it's should this character be black, should this character be Latino, should this character be whatever. And from there, he was able to make the X-Men a more colorful cast of characters. But he did it because he wanted to tell good stories. He wasn't looking to get points for diversifying this popular title. He was trying to tell good stories and come up with good characters that people would like. And because he was a good writer who knew that you can do interesting things if you think outside the box, he came up with characters who were female or anything else and made them more interesting simply because he was developing them as characters first. So this, I believe, is what it means when people say that you should write female characters the same way you write male characters. Ultimately, it just means write good characters. The thing is, I did say this piece of advice can be misinterpreted, and I think there's evidence to suggest that it has. But how do you misinterpret it? Well, like all those other lines that were mentioned in the Book Fox video, it's because it's just the one line, and it's often taken out of context and not elaborated on, or maybe you don't hear the elaboration if there is one. You might be able to misinterpret it. In this case, it would be easy to misinterpret the line, write women the same way you write men, to mean write women as men. And the result of that, if you only know how to write a man, might be that you try writing a woman who is so hyper-masculine that she really is just a man with one extra chromosome. And yes, I know, tomboys exist. It is possible for some women to be a little more masculine, just like it's possible for some men to be a little more feminine. But there is still a clear distinction most of the time to be made. And as we've seen in a lot of recent entertainment, there's this pervasive idea of what's come to be known as the girl boss. The idea of the girl boss, of course, is that they're pitched as being strong, independent, self-reliant, capable of doing whatever the men can do, but they oftentimes have traits that, if they were male characters, would be labeled as toxic masculinity. They are overly aggressive. They are incredibly lacking in feminine traits. They're basically just guys, like I mentioned. And that's clearly not appealing to a general audience. This, of course, is oftentimes the result of somebody just being a plain bad writer, where they might only have a basic understanding of how to write men and how to write women. So naturally, they would see a line like that, and if they misinterpret it, they would think, well, if I'm supposed to write a woman the way I'd write a man, and I write a man as masculine, that means I have to write the woman as masculine. And sometimes that leads to just a cast of masculinity, or sometimes it leads to the woman being masculine and the man being feminine. But as mentioned, that's not really the point of this advice. The advice is about remembering that you have to have good character writing in place and all the things that you would want for a good character, regardless of the kind of character you're writing. And that applies not just to the idea of writing a woman, it also applies to writing any character. If you are writing a character who's a different skin color than you, who comes from a different culture than you, then you still need to remember that this character needs all of those complexities. You have to give them arcs, you have to give them relationships, you have to give them motivations, things like that. And that, I think, is what it ultimately boils down to. I guess in a way I also made this video's title a little misleading, because this isn't really just about how to write female characters, it's just how to write characters. And that's something that is going to take a lot of practice. No one's going to get it perfect right off the bat. But ultimately, the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. So just keep that in mind. And hey, that doesn't even necessarily mean your characters have to be that complex. They just have to be good. They have to be entertaining. They have to be the sort of character that wins the audience over. And yeah, that was a very long-winded way of saying all of that, I suppose. Well, then again, I am a writer. I don't necessarily know how to say things that briefly. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off. Thank you all for watching. Now be sure to head down to the description to check us out on other platforms, as well as find links to the 5 current books in the Tales from the Omni Vault universe. Again, thank you all, and we'll see you next time.